We are going to talk about photosynthesis today. So here we have the overall equation where we basically take carbon dioxide and water, use them to build sugars, and then oxygen is a waste product. So by the time we're done, we want to be able to understand where in these complex processes is CO2 used, where is water used, where are the sugars produced, where is the oxygen produced, and of course, where does that light energy come in? Big picture overview kinds of concepts. One major concept, um, if you put a seed in a jar and you grow that seed, over time you will have a plant appear, and then the plant gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Where does the mass come from? And based on this equation, hopefully you realize that the mass, the added mass from the plant getting bigger, is actually coming from carbon dioxide and water. Plants are literally taking CO2 and water and using it to build sugars. And then remember, sugars make up the cellulose in their cell walls and other components. So they're literally adding mass to themselves by using carbon dioxide from the air and water. The other big picture concept is remember that this equation is exactly the opposite of cellular respiration. And so that's kind of a carbon cycle thing where plants take in CO2, use them to build sugars. During cellular respiration, animals and plants actually do cellular respiration as well, break sugars down to release CO2 as a waste product. So those things are in balance. And then finally, don't forget this is an endergonic process because we need to add energy in the form of light into it. And cellular respiration, of course, is exergonic in that we rip sugars apart and that gives off energy, which can then be coupled to the production of ATP. So let's just kind of get into the details of how this all works. I'm going to skip over some random slides here. And we're going to talk about the light dependent and the light independent reactions. So the light dependent reactions require light, and they use that light energy to make ATP and NADPH. These occur in the chloroplast, specifically in these little discs called the thylakoids. So I do a little Player's process here. The players include light, a specific wavelength of light is required. And then these photosystems. These photosystems are kind of interesting because they're proteins, but then there's these pigments clustered together, and there's a variety of pigments. And the green of your chlorophylls, but also oranges and yellows and all those other colors that you see only in the fall, they're all there, and they all absorb different wavelengths of light. And so some pieces to these photosystems. Note that there is what is called a primary electron acceptor protein here. This basically will capture a high energy electron and sort of keep it in this high energy state. That's going to be really important for later. There's the reaction center complex, which is this specific chlorophyll molecule that passes electrons to that primary electron acceptor. And then there's the light harvesting complex, which are all these other pigments, the greens, the oranges, the yellows, and they basically widen the what's called absorption spectrum of the plant, meaning that if you have different pigments, each of which can absorb a different wavelength of light, it means you can absorb lots of different wavelengths of light and harness that to be able to do useful things. So here's just another representation of that. Note that there's also two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, named in order of discovery, so it's kind of backwards. And then the P680-700, that's the wavelength of light that they absorb. And then here's just a picture of those photosystems. So here is the thylakoid disc, and you can see this membrane here, and these photosystems are embedded in that membrane. Here's another representation that just kind of shows those same photosystem in a more schematic way, and all these little circles represent those different pigments. Okay, the next player is water, and water, you may recall, was a reactant of photosynthesis, and we see that it's going to donate electrons that are lost at the photosystems, foreshadowing. We need ADP phosphate and NAD+, and these are just kind of reactants that kind of come into play, and then the chloroplast itself, which is where this takes place. So how does this all go down? So the light-dependent reactions, as I said, they occur in these thylakoids, these little discs. Here's a cross-section of that disc. Here we have our photosystem. And then interestingly, ATP synthase. We saw that in cellular respiration. How interesting. Let's see what happens. So the first thing that happens is a specific wavelength of light hits the photosystem. And when it hits the photosystem, that causes an electron to jump, woohoo, to a higher energy level. Now, when that electron falls back down to its ground state, and you can see that up here, right? The light excites the electron and it falls back down. When that electron falls back down, it gives off energy. That energy is used to excite a neighboring electron. So that one jumps up. And then when that electron falls back to its ground state, that excites the next one. And then that excites the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And finally, this reaction center chlorophyll gets excited, woohoo! But instead of falling back down to its ground state, it is snatched by this protein, this primary electron acceptor. So in class, I basically have 10 kids line up, each with a tennis ball. The first kid throws their ball in the air. As that ball falls, the next kid throws their ball in the air. As that falls, the next kid throws their ball in the air, all the way down. But then when this ball gets thrown in the air, I snatch it in that high energy state. So high potential energy, it's caught. And so now we can do something useful with that high energy electron. And that's what comes next. So next is we generate ATP using an electron transport chain. This is the same process that happens in cellular respiration. The electron is passed from that primary electron acceptor to another protein, to another protein, to another protein. And in the process, protons are pumped against their gradient, and then those protons go back down their gradient through ATP synthase, and the energy is used to make ATP. And in my previous video on cellular respiration, I go into more detail on that, but it's basically the exact same process. So this is how we get ATP. We have a high energy electron excited by light, and then we pass it down this electron transport chain. Side note, cellular respiration, same deal. The high energy electron this time though comes from NADH or FADH2. And those electrons became high energy because we ripped glucose apart to make NADH and FADH2. So again, very similar process. Now, the final electron acceptor for this electron transport chain, woohoo, is actually photosystem 1. And that is, because photosystem 1 also has electrons getting excited and leaving. So this electron from photosystem 2 replaces the electron lost from photosystem 1. And then we have to replace the electron in photosystem 2, and that's where water comes in. Water will donate an electron to replace the one that was excited and passed on, and then in the process, water becomes oxygen. This is why water is required, and oxygen is a waste product. That's the step right there in photosystem 2. Note that this is the opposite of what happens in cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, oxygen accepts the electron to become water. Here, water is donating an electron to become oxygen. Okay, so we've passed our electron, we've sent it down. Now photosystem 1, again, light hits it just like before, bounces through the photosystem pigments, and eventually, woohoo, up to that primary electron acceptor. This time it ultimately gets passed to this enzyme, which then converts NADP plus to NADPH. So now we have ATP, and we have NADPH, which basically is an electron carrier. So now we have energy and we have electrons that can be used by the cell. That is where the light-independent reactions come in. They are now going to use that ATP and NADPH to actually build a sugar. And this occurs in the stroma, kind of the inner goo of the chloroplast. And it takes place in what's called the Calvin cycle. Again, called a cycle because we do a bunch of chemical reactions and then regenerate our starting material. So you don't need to worry about all the details of the Calvin cycle. Here's what you need to know. We're going to bring carbon dioxide atoms in, and we are going to build a sugar out of them. So 3 carbons come in, 3 carbons come out, and those 3 carbons are ultimately used to make glucose. And in order to make that sugar, we need energy and we need electrons. And lo and behold, if you look at these reactions that are happening, energy is provided by ATP, NADPH provides electrons, and that allows us to build our carbohydrates. So again, those light dependent reactions made the energy and electrons available, and then the light independent reactions use those things to build our sugar. Once the sugar is built, we kind of regenerate our starting molecule, and then more carbon dioxide comes in, more sugars go out. More carbon dioxide goes in, more sugars go out. Yeah, so this is where our carbon dioxide is used. That is where our sugars are produced. So that's pretty much it for cellular respiration. And again, pay attention to those compare contrasts with cellular respiration, because I think that enhances your understanding of both processes. Hope that was helpful. Thanks.